hundreds of millions of dollars, whether it's, and in fact, in terms of home energy retrofit, it's in the billions of dollars, heat pump programs, electric vehicles, renewable energy. That's how we will help Canadians reduce their dependencies on fossil fuels, go for cleaner, cheaper, and more efficient systems.
Minister, just before I let you go, I wanted to ask you one more question about in your capacity as a Quebec minister, and it's about essentially what's been going back and forth with the Bloc Québécois and especially their proposal to boost old age security. As a minister of Quebec, are you okay with the Bloc determining government policy?
No, absolutely not, which is why we voted against this. So their proposal, we're certainly in favor of supporting seniors, which is why we brought back the retirement age from 67 years, which the previous government, Harper government, Conservative government, put in place to 65. We've put in place a number of measures to support seniors, but what the Bloc was proposing was fiscally...
Politicians in this country, and I'll tell you why I ask more specifically. So you point to economists that have labeled this as a very cost-effective way of doing things. There's probably nobody more at the forefront of that, and someone I've been interviewing for years on this subject than Professor Chris Reagan, whom I also interviewed when your government gave a carve-out to home heating, which primarily affected Atlantic Canada. The Prime Minister made that announcement surrounded by Atlantic Canadian Liberal MPs. Mr. Reagan, Professor Reagan at the time, anticipated that would be the death of this policy, as written by your party. So for you to be sort of, critical of everyone else for caving to the pressure, what responsibility do you bear for being the architect of that pressure?
I think we're doing much better in terms of how we communicate this to Canadians. Next week on Tuesday, people will be receiving their quarterly payment in provinces where the federal pricing system is applied. We now have all the banks and financial institutions on hard work, and we have to sustain it.
Respectfully, though, Minister, I wasn't asking you about a communications difficulty. I was asking you about the role that your government played in creating the backlash to this by essentially offering a carve-out that was politically motivated to Atlantic Canada. And I know you're going to say it wasn't politically motivated, that there are other homes that qualify for this across the country, but 25% of the homes in Atlantic Canada use home heating oil versus I think it's 6% in the rest of the country. Plus, Minister Goody Hutchings came on this program about a year ago, somewhere in the neighborhood of that, and said that if other parts of the country wanted to qualify for a carve-out like that, they should elect more Liberals.
I can't speak to what my colleague said. What I can tell you is that in my home province of Quebec, where I am now, there are more Quebecers using home heating oil than in all of Atlantic Canada put together.
Not as a portion of the resources used, though.
No, but in absolute terms, there are more people in Quebec that use oil to heat their homes than in all of...
First of all, that he didn't model out the benefits or the jobs created associated with the carbon tax, nor the impact of climate change. On the first, and we'll go through both, on the first, what is the model for that? I have never heard from your government a specific amount of jobs that this tax specifically creates, because I think it's clear, just based on political reaction from like-minded premiers and politicians, not conservatives in this case. I'm thinking of David Eby and Wab Kinew and Jagmeet Singh and Andrew Furey, as well as people who are just existing in the world running small businesses, that they certainly don't feel that this has been responsible for economic development, for example.
We have published numerous analysis of the economic benefits, and there's been a number of independent analysis that have been published, but the consensus or the rough estimates right now is that carbon pricing is generating about $25 billion.
Fiscal side of things, yes, it does, so that there is that there is a progressive impact. When you're looking at the fiscal and economic portion of things or analysis of things, it's very broad-based that Canadians are worse off. It's not just the highest quintile. Is it perhaps that, and I separate the conservative criticism for a moment, because I know that's what your government likes to focus on. So much of that criticism comes from within your own ranks, progressive side of politics. Like, is Wab Kinew against this because he wants to help his rich friends? Is Andrew Furey against this because he wants to help his rich friends?
No, I think in both the case of Premier Furey and the NDP, whether it's the NDP in Manitoba, BC, or federal NDP, they cave to the pressure. I mean, there is a lot of pressure on progressive politicians around this. So the parliamentary budget officer says it's the most effective way of fighting climate change. A cause is to help us put in place measures, and we've deployed hundreds of millions of dollars across the country, from BC to the Atlantic provinces to the north, to help people make that transition. So that, I mean, if you're using this tool to incentivize change, but people can't change because they don't have the mean to it, then it may be working from an environmental perspective, but it's certainly not working from a social perspective.
But that's kind of the point, right? That's the point that people in other parts of the country that aren't even using just home heating oil feel. They don't feel like it's easy to buy an electric car, for example, yet. And I know that your government has plans in place to help incentivize that further and help make that more affordable. But right now, they just don't feel it is. And they feel like unless they elect Liberals, that falls on deaf ears. Pardon me.
Sales of electric vehicles have quadrupled in the last 3 years in Canada. In Quebec, 1 in 5 vehicles sold right now is an electric vehicle. In British Columbia, it's 1 in 4.
Okay, so picture this. You've just had a new baby. Congrats, right? But the grandparents, they're getting that look in their eyes. You know, the one they want to be closer, but where would they even go? It's like a classic Canadian housing puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's something the Prime Minister's been tackling head-on in some recent announcements. We've been going through his latest speech and the Q&A. And let me tell you, there's a lot to unpack.
It's interesting, though, because it's not just about, like, building a ton more massive condos. It's much more thought out than that. The Prime Minister keeps using the phrase multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, and another phrase that kept coming up was gentle density. So it's about creating more places for people to live, but doing it within the neighborhoods that already exist. Like, think basement suites, those little backyard cottages, maybe even a laneway house. But how is the average person supposed to make that happen right? Well, get this. New mortgage rules are coming out to make it easier.
And these aren't like the old school mortgage rules either. We're talking about refinancing your mortgage and getting a 30-year amortization for up to $2 million, specifically for building one of these secondary suites. That's a pretty big deal. For anyone who's not a mortgage expert, a 30-year amortization just means lower monthly payments. It makes it way more doable for people to afford these renovations. It's almost like he's saying, hey, if you want to be a part of the solution, here's some breathing room in your budget.
So instead of just depending on the big developers, he's giving everyday Canadians the power to maybe become landlords, even if it's just for their own family.
Exactly. It's a really interesting approach. Imagine having your parents close by in a cozy little backyard suite, or giving your adult kids a head start with a place of their own. It's all about making it possible for more Canadians to own a home and maybe even live with multiple generations under one roof.
Okay, but here's the thing. Even with more affordable housing options, you still need a decent income to afford any of it, right? And that's something the Prime Minister seems pretty concerned about too. He even wrote a whole book about it. Plutocrats, the rise of the global super elite and the fall of everyone else. Kind of a mouthful, huh?
Yeah. It does make you wonder if that gap between the super rich and everyone else is just getting bigger and bigger. The Prime Minister definitely seems to think so. He's talking about how it's not just an economic issue either. It's social, it's political, it's about what it means to live in Canada.
It's about making sure everyone has a shot at a good life. So how is he planning to tackle this whole income inequality thing?
Well, one big piece of the puzzle is early learning and childcare. He actually used Ontario as an example. Apparently, childcare costs there are already down by something like 50%. Families are saving an average of like $8,000 per kid every year. And the goal is to cut those costs even further. They're aiming for a national $10 a day system.
Seriously? I mean, as someone who's seen those childcare bills firsthand, $10 a day would be life-changing. Forget a sigh of relief. That's like a full-on dance party for a lot of parents.
Totally. And it's not just about saving money either. It's about giving parents more choices. Affordable childcare would make it easier for parents, especially moms, to go back to work if they want to. It's about giving people more opportunities and flexibility.
And speaking of making things a little easier on the wallet, he also talked about that new dental care program. Sounds like a lot of people are already signing up for that. Something like 2 million Canadians and counting, I think he said.
Which makes sense, right? Dental care is so important, but it can get really expensive. This program is supposed to help with that so people don't have to choose between paying their bills and taking care of their teeth.
It's about having peace of mind, knowing you can get the care you need without going broke.
Exactly. And then there's the push for more green jobs.
Yeah.
But not just any green jobs. The Prime Minister was really clear about needing strong labor requirements.
So making sure these jobs actually pay a living wage with decent benefits, right?
Right.
Not just creating a whole new category of low-paying jobs in a brand new industry.
Exactly. It's about giving people a real path to the middle class. Making sure that the switch to a greener economy actually helps everyone. So yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here, from building more homes to making those homes more affordable and dealing with this big issue of income inequality. But what about the economic engine that's going to make all of this happen? The Prime Minister had this really interesting meeting with a tech CEO that kind of gets at that.
So they were talking about critical minerals, those things that are like the basic building blocks for everything from electric car batteries to those fancy solar panels everyone wants these days.
Yeah, it's a pretty crucial point, actually, because as the whole world tries to switch over to this greener economy, the demand for critical minerals is going way up. And here's the thing, Canada's got a lot of them, just sitting there.
Okay, so we've got the good stuff. We're all set then, right?
Not quite. Here's the catch. China's kind of got a monopoly on the whole critical minerals thing right now. They control a huge part of the supply chain, and that's a big challenge for Canada and all of our allies.
So it's like a tug of war over these resources.
Kind of. There's this big push for everyone to diversify, basically, to find other places to get these critical minerals, so we're not all relying on China so much. The Prime Minister even mentioned something about targeted Chinese action, like they're trying to stop anyone else from competing with them. It's a messy situation with some pretty big potential consequences.
Speaking of messy situations, what about those basement suites and backyard cottages we were talking about before? It's great if you can afford to build one, but what about people who can't even afford to buy a place in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Will any of this actually help younger generations get into the housing market, or are they just going to get priced out even more as prices keep going up? The Prime Minister seems to think that building more homes will eventually make prices go down, but it's something we'll have to wait and see about.
But couldn't all this gentle density cause some other problems? What if every other house on your street suddenly had a basement suite or a laneway house? Wouldn't that totally change the feel of the neighborhood?
That's an interesting thought. Is there such a thing as too much housing? It's not an easy question to answer, and it's something that communities are going to have to figure out as these policies start to have an effect. But on a more serious note, we can't finish this deep dive without talking about another really important issue facing Canada, the opioid crisis.
You're right. The Prime Minister didn't shy away from it at all. And he talked about it in a really compassionate way. You could tell that he understands how much this is hurting people, individuals, families, entire communities right across the country.
He really emphasized the need to find a balance between keeping the public safe and getting people the treatment they need. He kept saying that addiction is a health problem, not just a criminal justice problem. It's about giving people support and resources, not just locking them up.
And finally, let's talk about something that affects a lot of Canadians directly, pharmacare. The legislation passed. So when can we expect to see those benefits that were promised, like free contraception and medication for diabetes?
The Prime Minister seems really gung-ho to get these programs up and running, but he did admit that there are still some roadblocks, especially when it comes to working with the provinces and territories. There's a lot of talk about everyone working together and finding common ground. We'll just have to see how smooth the whole process actually is. So there you have it. We've covered a ton of ground today, everything from basement suites and mortgage renewals to critical minerals and the opioid crisis. It's pretty clear that there are both big opportunities and big challenges ahead on the road to a more affordable and equitable Canada.
And you know what? I don't know about you, but I feel like I've got even more questions now than I did before. Will any of this actually make a real difference? Can we figure out how to navigate this whole global resources situation and make sure Canada has a good spot in the world? And maybe most importantly, what are we all going to do to help shape the future of our own communities? These are questions we all need to think about as we move forward.
For sure.
If this deep dive got you thinking or even just inspired you to get a little more involved, then we've done our job. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and searching for those insightful answers. This, The Deep Dive, signing off.